The idea is to discriminate between where it is exactly that you can act and do it, and then accept that, sometimes there are certain things in life they are the way they are. Nothing you can do about it. Now that scales up to the social and political level. For instance, right now, I live in interesting times in the United States of America, for instance, right? And there are certain things I can do. I can vote, I can join street protests, I can talk to people, I can write about it, and I've done all of those things. One thing that I cannot do is to just decide that the situation should be over and change it.
So, hello Massimo Pigliucci and welcome to How the Light Gets In Festival.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've had a remarkably varied career, from evolutionary biology to debunking pseudoscience to making Stoicism accessible as a form of self-help. What, if anything, ties all these interests together?
That's a good question. They are kind of tied together. I started out as a scientist. My field was evolutionary biology. My first career appointment was in Tennessee and the south of the United States, where there is 95% creationists. So right there, I ran into some kind of conflict between science and pseudoscience. That got me interested in that aspect of things. From there, the step was not that far from developing an interest in philosophy of science in general, because philosophy of science is very close to sort of conceptual theoretical biology, which is what I was pursuing as a scientist. So once then a midlife crisis happened that triggered the complete switch from one field to the other. Once you become a philosopher, then it's a whole new vista. You look at very different things in a very different way. The above mentioned midlife crisis was still there, so I thought, I got to work on this one, and that led me to Stoicism. So it's one thing led to another, little by little, over the course of years.
So what was it about Stoicism that you thought helped the midlife crisis?
So when you go through a midlife crisis, typically what happens is you're looking for a different framework, for a different way of looking at things, for a way to reprioritize things. And so philosophy of life, typically, that's exactly what it does. So I went about it systematically. I studied a little bit of Buddhism. I studied Aristotle. I studied Epicurus. I went here and there, modern philosophies like psychohumanism and existentialism, and none of them really did it. And then I opened up a book by a guy named Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher, and I kind of heard the click at the back of my mind. It's like, yeah, this guy really speaks your language. You should read more about it. And sure enough, that was it.
Fantastic. So in a world that we are kind of increasingly feeling quite helpless by political systems and feeling like actions can't really do anything and a lot of things are outside of our control, do you think that potentially the dichotomy of control, that Stoic principle, one of the key tenets, risks actually reinforcing political helplessness and inaction?
It's a very good question. I think the answer is no, but we need to understand exactly what the dichotomy of control, so-called dichotomy of control, is. That's actually a modern term. The ancient Stoics did not use that. They talked about what is up to us and what is not up to us, meaning what kinds of things we are actually responsible for, ultimately, and what kinds of things we're not ultimately responsible for because they depend on external factors that are not really up to us. So the general idea is that it helps if you focus on the things you can do and at the same time develop an attitude of equanimity and kind of acceptance toward the things you cannot do. So let me start with a simple example. Yesterday I was due here in the afternoon. So I got on a plane from Milan, and then I got on a train, and then the train stopped in the middle of the route and said, sorry, we're not going forward, there's an accident. That is not up to me, right? That's not under my control. There was nothing I can do about it. What I could do about it is to try to find out alternative ways to get here, which I did. And then after we found that, I just sat down and read a book because there was nothing else to do. So that's the notion. The idea is not to do anything, or to say, well, I'm sorry, this is out of my business. The idea is to discriminate between where it is exactly that you can act and do it, and then accept that, sometimes there are certain things in life They are the way they are. Nothing you can do about it. Now that scales up to the social and political level. For instance, right now, I live in interesting times in the United States of America, for instance, right? And there are certain things I can do. I can vote. I can give money to organizations that try to change things in a certain direction. I can join street protests. I can talk to people. I can write about it. And I've done all of those things. One thing that I cannot do is to just decide that the situation should be over and change it.
But what about those people that do those things and still see nothing changing and nothing happening? Does not relinquishing control, having done those things and say, well, that's me done, I've given up to this stage of what I can actually do, and then have that repeated and repeated and repeated, does that not risk inaction?
It risks inaction only if you do it badly, right? So the idea is you don't give up. You just assess where you can make a difference and accept where you cannot, at least temporarily. If the situation changes, then you readjust your strategy and you do things differently, right? I mean, what is the point of heading, butting your head toward a wall if you know that the wall is not going to break, your head will break, right? That's not very useful. On the other hand, trying to figure out ways to get around the wall or on top of the wall or below the wall maybe, or get some other way to get to demolish the wall. But just banging the head, it's not very useful.
What if the wall in this context was climate change and
Yes.
kind of having to battle both government policy and corporate policy and, interpersonal, individual kind of abilities to, enact climate positive kind of
Right.
actions?
Right.
How does the Stoic principle of the dichotomy of control kind of impact that?
The same approach applies. You ask yourself, okay, what I'm concerned with what? With climate change. Great. What kinds of things can I do where they're going to make a difference? And the answer to that, of course, depends on who you are, what your access is to resources, what your abilities are, right? So some people are very good at, public speaking, for instance. Other people are good at organizing others, protests and things like that. Other people have a lot of money and they can funnel that money into their activities. And the majority of people, of course, cannot do any of those things, but they can still inform themselves, vote, support their causes in certain ways. So there is no universal answer. The answer, however, is never, I'm going to give up. It's only going to be, let me see what I can do.
Okay. So veering sort of towards the debunking pseudoscience aspect of your career, I was wondering if in the kind of post-COVID, post-truth, post-expert era, I don't really know what to label this, how do you think your work individually, particularly in regard to debunking pseudoscience, has changed?
It has certainly made it more difficult, right? The post-truth kind of thing, and your opinion is my opinion, and therefore I can, I'm my own expert, that kind of stuff. It's a relatively recent development. Until not that many years ago, people would say, okay, I'm listening to this person or that person because I trust them, because they're experts in a certain area. Now we live in a situation where everybody's its own experts because they can go to Google, or worse, they can ask an AI system and they think that they're getting all the answers. So it makes it more difficult because now you not only have to fight against the misinformation or the misunderstandings of the basic science, now you have to fight a war of credibility, right? And it really, at the end of the day, it does come down to trust. Because think about it, even experts, they're not experts in everything, right? So I'm an expert in evolutionary biology and philosophy of science. That's about it. Yeah, Stoicism a little bit, but that's about it. So there's lots of stuff where I have to trust somebody. For instance, if you ask me, do you believe in quantum mechanics? The answer is yes. But then don't ask me why, because I'm going to tell you, well, my friend, the physicist in the other department, tells me that that's the way to go. And so I go that way. I'm not an expert in that field. I have to decide who I trust and on what basis. And we all do that if you think about it. Outside of technical fields, if you have a problem with your car, where do you go? You go to a car mechanic, not to a priest or a dentist or something like that, right? Why? Because the car mechanic is the expert. Now, that doesn't mean that the mechanic is going to be infallible, right? Everybody makes mistakes, including experts. But if the mechanic makes mistakes repeatedly and he gives you back the car and the car doesn't work, then eventually you're going to go to somebody else. But again, you're going to go to another mechanic, not to a priest. We all do that in regular day-to-day life. For some reason, we got to a situation, however, where people do that in all instances except when it comes to science, right? I have, for instance, a close relative of mine who during the pandemic called me up and she said, so Massimo, can you send me a copy of the original papers about the research on the pandemic? And I said, well, I can do that, but why would you want them? Oh, I want to read them. I said, but okay, I'm a biologist and I would have a hard time reading them because my field is in evolutionary biology, not in virology or epidemiology. So I could read them, but it would take me a significant amount of effort. Why are you into it? And she said, well, I took a course in statistics in college 20 years ago. Oh, that's all the qualifications that it takes. Sure, go ahead. But that's the problem. People overestimate what they can do. They don't seem to have a grasp of just how difficult a lot of these issues actually are, which is why you need experts in the first place. I don't know how to get out of this, other than, of course, the obvious, more education, more talking in situations like this, more coming to these kinds of festivals and so on and so forth. But it's a long road and it's definitely uphill.
So is there any particular example or anecdote you have of, apart from,
my relatives,
your relative, of you kind of engaging with someone in a way that, you felt have significantly changed in the last, let's say, pre-COVID to this era?
That's a good question. Often the way I've seen changes is when I do interviews, not like this one necessarily, but a lot of podcasts. I do a lot of podcasts. And podcasters are a very varied bunch. There are some of them who are really well prepared and they ask really good questions and it's kind of fun. And then there are others that have they have their own agenda. They have done their research and they want to get you into a sort of a gotcha moment sort of thing. That is new. I did not experience that until a few years ago. I'm sure it happened occasionally, but it's definitely not a thing. Now it happens very frequently. And part of the reason for that is because, of course, everybody can be a podcaster. It's not a actual job, it's not an actual profession. It's the kind of thing that if you have a microphone and a computer, there you go. You're a podcaster, or you're a blogger, or you're whatever. And on the one hand, that's good because it means that there is a process of opening up information and discussion to everybody. But then the result of that is that you get a cacophony of voices, many of which, frankly, are difficult to listen to.
So, kind of linking to that, you have left a particularly extensive digital footprint with heated disagreements with various academics on the internet. Very enjoyable to read. So is there anyone that stands out as a particular favorite, like any disagreement? Yeah,
David Chalmers. I know David. He works at NYU in New York, and I work at Civil University in New York. We've met several times. He's a really nice guy, but he's very good at what he does. But we have a fundamental disagreement of the nature of what he does. So he's a metaphysician, and we would have to start by asking, what the heck is a metaphysician? These days, I think that position is done. I don't think there should be any metaphysics. But metaphysics literally means beyond physics, right? And what that means historically is metaphysicians are people who use our normal understanding of the world, and then they try to go beyond in the sense of they're trying to dig into the underlying nature of reality. And they do that by thinking about it, by thinking about what are the consequences of the kind of stuff that we have already discovered, and what does that kind of stuff tell us about the underlying nature of reality. These days we have another activity that does exactly the same thing. It's called science, and it does it much better. And it does it much better for a simple reason, because scientists, especially physicists, don't just think about stuff. They do experiments with very, very expensive pieces of machinery. And those experiments have been very successful and uncovering things that classical metaphysicians have never been able to think about or uncover. So when I have my conversations with David, I keep telling him that, you know, he's living in the wrong century. That a few centuries ago, it would have been great. But now he's doing the kind of job that it's much better done by particle accelerators. And of course, you can imagine that leads to disagreements.
Sure, but is there a reason why it's your favorite? Is it because?
Because he's very smart, and because he's so it's readily easy to pick a fight with somebody who does actual pseudoscience. Like I debated creationists, for instance, or people who believe in astrology or something like that. That's easy. Not easy in the sense that it's easy necessary to do the debate, because some of these people are actually very articulate and they're very convincing to our general audience. But it's easy in terms of I don't really need to prepare a lot in order to debunk an astrologer or a creationist. To have a discussion, a meaningful discussion with somebody like David, on the other hand, you really need to know what the heck you're talking about, even though you completely disagree with his approach. And so it's more fun.
Great answer. So what is your opinion on paranormal activity and ghosts? Is that complete pseudoscience, or is there any ground of fact?
Complete pseudoscience. Oh. I'm sorry. Look, a skeptic, which I think I am, I try to be at least, is somebody who inquires into things. It doesn't know everything, and it doesn't pretend to know everything. Skeptic literally means inquirer. However, there are certain things that we've inquired over for like 2,000 years. And every single time we come up empty-handed. So after a while, you have to ask yourself, how many more ghosts do I have to investigate? Or how many more paranormal phenomena do I have to investigate? I actually did something interesting a few years ago in terms of investigation of one particular type of paranormal phenomenon, dowsing. So these are the people that claim that they can find water with a stick. And so we set up a group that I was part of. We set up an experiment. This guy said, "Yeah, I can find water." Okay. So we took a large area. We put a bunch of buckets. Some of them were empty. Some of them had water. We showed him the ones that were empty, the ones that had water. Does your stick work? Yes, absolutely. It was like going like mad on the water, nothing at all on the empty buckets. Great. So then we covered everything. We randomized the bucket, so I could now find the water. He found it exactly 50% of the time, which is what you would expect by chance, right? So we thought, okay, that's it. That settles it. Yes. Can we agree that you do not have that power? And he looked at us, and in full sincerity, because I'm pretty sure he was sincere, he said, "No, I think what happened is that the proximity of skeptics interferes with my powers. I have them, but they manifest themselves only when you don't test them." Well, isn't that convenient?
That is convenient. Oh.
Oh, yeah, indeed.
Shame.
I would love it, right? If there are certain kinds of paranormal or similar phenomena that I would love it if they were true. Not telepathy. I don't think it would be good for us to read each other's mind.
I agree.
They're, I have my private thoughts. I don't necessarily want to broadcast them out there. But UFOs? Oh gosh, I would love it if a flying saucer were to land right here. I would volunteer to go there and greet them.
So no chance for aliens as well then?
Well, there might be aliens, but they're not here.
Oh, yeah.
As far as we can tell.
Area 51?
Oh no.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so thank you very much, Massimo. I've had a great time. I hope you have too.
It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic.